The rain drummed steadily against the pavement, casting a gray gloom over the small college town in Texas. Mark Davis hunched his shoulders against the cold, his worn jacket doing little to shield him from the downpour. His sneakers splashed through puddles as he trudged along the sidewalk, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Every step felt heavier than the last, burdened not just by the weight of his books, but by the crushing reality of his life. At 23, Mark was barely holding himself together. Law school had been a dream, one his father had worked tirelessly to support, until a sudden illness had taken him, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt that had drowned their family. Now, Mark worked long hours at a part-time job, scraping together enough to keep up with tuition, rent, and the expenses his mother could no longer cover. But it was never enough. His mother's condition was worsening, and his younger sister's college tuition loomed on the horizon like an approaching storm. No matter how hard he tried, the walls were closing in, suffocating him. As he walked, lost in thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He nearly ignored it, assuming it was another payment reminder or perhaps his landlord demanding rent. But something made him pull it out. The number was unfamiliar. Mark Davis speaking. He answered, his voice laced with exhaustion. A composed, authoritative voice responded, clear and deliberate. "Mr. Davis, this is Eleanor Brooks. I'd like to meet with you. It's regarding your financial situation." Mark frowned, stopping in his tracks. "I'm sorry, who are you? And how do you know about?" "I know enough," she interrupted smoothly. "Meet me at Brooks Bistro, 7 o'clock. Before he could ask anything else, the line went dead. Mark stood there, phone still pressed to his ear, his pulse quickening. Who was this woman? How did she know about his debts? And why would she want to meet him? Something about her tone unsettled him. Firm, confident, as though she had already decided how this would go. Still, curiosity gnawed at him, stronger than his apprehension. There was no harm in hearing her out, right? The rain had worsened by the time Mark pushed open the doors to Brooks Bistro. The warm glow of the cafe was a stark contrast to the storm outside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked bread filled the air, momentarily comforting him. His damp clothes clung to his skin as he scanned the room, unsure of what, or who, he was looking for. Then he saw her. Eleanor Brooks sat at a corner table, poised with an elegance that made her seem untouchable. Silver hair, perfectly styled, framed a face marked by time but untouched by weakness. She wore a tailored suit that exuded wealth, her piercing blue eyes watching him as he approached. "Mark," she greeted, gesturing toward the seat opposite her. Her voice was smooth, almost soothing, yet it carried an undeniable authority. Mark hesitated before pulling out the chair. He sat stiffly, his mind racing. "Mrs. Brooks, what is this about?" She took a measured sip of her tea before setting the cup down. Straight to the point. "Good." Her gaze settled on him, unwavering. "Mark, I know about your debts. The ones your father left behind. I know you're barely scraping by." His fingers curled around the edge of the table. "How? That's not important." She leaned in slightly. "What is important is that I can help you." Mark narrowed his eyes. "Help me? Why would you?" She cut him off with 3 words that sent a shockwave through him. "Marry me." The words hung between them, heavy and surreal. Mark stared at her, convinced he had misheard. "Excuse me." "You heard me," she said, her voice steady. "This isn't about romance. It's a business arrangement. I will pay off all your debts, secure your financial future, and in return, you will be my husband." Mark let out a disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "You're serious?" He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Why me? You don't even know me." Eleanor's lips curled into the faintest smile. "That's exactly why. You are young, unattached, and..." She paused, tilting her head, desperate enough to consider this. Mark bristled at her bluntness. "And what do you get out of it?" For the first time, something flickered in her expression, something almost human. "Companionship," she said simply. "I have no children, no family left. I've spent my life alone, Mark, and I don't intend to die that way." He studied her, trying to make sense of it all. There was more to this than she was telling him. But the lure of financial security dangled before him like a lifeline in a storm. Still, he shook his head. This is insane. Eleanor set down her cup with a quiet clink. Think of it as a contract, she said smoothly. You need money. I need a husband. Simple. Mark stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. I can't. I need time to think. Eleanor nodded, unfazed. Of course, but don't take too long. The offer doesn't stand forever. That night, Mark sat at the kitchen table, his mother across from him, her pale hands wrapped around a mug of tea. The dim light overhead cast shadows across her tired face, making her look older than she was. After explaining Eleanor's proposal, silence stretched between them. Mom, Mark finally said, voice raw, you're asking me to marry a woman I don't love just to solve our problems. His mother's fingers trembled as she set the mug down. I'm asking you to save yourself, she whispered. To save us. Mark swallowed hard, staring at the table. His mother had always been strong, but now he saw just how much the weight of their circumstances had broken her. He thought of his father, of the promises he had made to take care of his family. He thought of his sister, of the future she deserved. He thought of the crushing debts, the sleepless nights, the jobs that barely kept him afloat. He thought of Eleanor's cold, calculating eyes, and the way her offer had felt like both a lifeline and a trap. Finally, Mark exhaled, feeling the last bit of his pride crumble. The next morning, he returned to Brooks Bistro. Eleanor was already there, sipping her tea, calm as ever. She didn't look up when he approached. You've decided? She asked. Mark took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. I'll do it. Eleanor smiled faintly, setting down her tablet. Good. The arrangements will be made immediately. The courthouse was nearly empty, the air thick with a sterile silence that made Mark's skin prickle. He stood beside Eleanor, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like an iron cage. The judge, a tired-looking man in his 60s, read through the formalities in a monotone voice, his eyes betraying no curiosity about the unusual pairing before him. The only witnesses were Eleanor's lawyer and a notary, both of whom had clearly done this before, facilitating arrangements, not weddings. Mark's fingers twitched at his side as the judge prompted him to repeat the vows. His mouth felt dry. The words were simple, rehearsed, but as they left his lips, they carried an unnatural weight. Eleanor, on the other hand, spoke them with precision, her voice steady, as if she were signing off on a business contract rather than pledging herself to another person. When the words husband and wife were finally uttered, Eleanor turned to him with a faint smile, one that never quite reached her eyes. Welcome to your new life, Mr. Davis, she murmured. Mark barely felt the judge shake his hand before he was ushered out of the room. The rain had returned, misting the world in a gray haze as they stepped onto the courthouse steps. He glanced at his reflection in a puddle, the water rippling as a raindrop struck the surface. The man staring back at him looked unfamiliar. Had he just saved his family? Or had he sold his soul? The car ride to Eleanor's estate was long and eerily silent. The city streets gave way to winding country roads lined with sprawling trees, their branches curling overhead like skeletal fingers. Mark stared out the window, watching as the scenery changed from familiar gas stations and strip malls to vast, empty fields. The farther they drove, the more isolated he felt. When the wrought iron gates finally appeared in the distance, flanked by towering stone pillars, Mark inhaled sharply. The estate beyond them was massive, practically a museum. The mansion sat at the top of a hill, its grand facade looming against the stormy sky. Towering columns framed the entrance, and the massive double doors were flanked by stone gargoyles, their features worn with age. The windows stretched high, dark and lifeless, like the eyes of something ancient and watchful. His stomach churned. The driver pulled up to the grand entrance, and a uniformed housekeeper opened the door for them. Eleanor stepped out first, moving with effortless grace, as if she had never known anything outside of luxury. Mark followed, gripping the handle of his suitcase tightly. Inside, the house was just as imposing. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, adorned with a crystal chandelier that glowed dimly in the cavernous space. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow him as he moved. The scent of polished wood and aged leather filled the air. Eleanor glanced at him over her shoulder. "Dinner is at 7. Then she was gone, disappearing down one of the many long corridors, leaving Mark standing in the grand foyer like an uninvited guest. A housekeeper led him upstairs to his room, a massive space with a king-sized bed, antique furniture, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking an expanse of manicured gardens. It was luxurious but cold. The sheets were crisp, the air untouched by warmth, as though no one had ever truly lived in this room. He set his suitcase down, exhaling slowly. This wasn't a home. It was a gilded cage. Dinner was a quiet, formal affair. The dining table stretched long enough to seat a dozen guests, but only 2 plates had been set, one at each end. Eleanor sat with perfect posture, dressed impeccably in a silk blouse and pearls, her every movement precise. Mark, still in the suit she had provided for the wedding, felt uncomfortably out of place. The meal was extravagant. A chef he had never seen prepared the dishes, and a silent staff served them with mechanical efficiency. Mark's fork scraped against the porcelain plate as he pushed his food around, the weight of the room pressing down on him. "I trust you're settling in," Eleanor said finally, cutting into her filet mignon with surgical precision. Mark cleared his throat. "It's different," he admitted. "This place is huge. Feels like I'll get lost." Eleanor smirked. "You'll get used to it, or you won't. Either way, you're here." The bluntness of her words sent a chill down his spine. He set his fork down, watching her. "You never mentioned much about your late husband." Eleanor's knife paused mid-cut. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin before speaking. "He was a businessman, like your father. Their paths crossed once or twice." Something in her tone darkened. Mark frowned, and she met his gaze, her blue eyes cold. Not all encounters end well. His pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Eleanor picked up her glass of wine, swirling the liquid as she spoke. "Let's just say unfinished business has a way of lingering." Mark swallowed. The rest of dinner passed in silence. Later that night, unable to sleep, Mark wandered the halls of the estate. The house was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. As he passed through the dimly lit corridors, his eyes were drawn to several doors, each of them locked. Their brass handles gleamed under the soft glow of the sconces, their presence unsettling. He could feel it. Secrets lived within these walls. Secrets he wasn't meant to know. Further down the hall, he heard something, a hushed conversation. Mark slowed his steps, straining to listen. "Why him?" a voice whispered. "He doesn't know yet," another murmured. A pause. "She never does anything without a reason." Mark's stomach twisted. The voices faded as quickly as they had come, leaving only the heavy silence of the house pressing down on him. He turned back toward his room, his heartbeat loud in his ears. Something wasn't right. He had stepped into a life that wasn't his own, and it was becoming painfully clear that Eleanor Brooks hadn't chosen him at random. She had chosen him for a reason, and whatever that reason was, he wasn't sure he wanted to find out. The days at Eleanor's estate passed in an eerie rhythm, each moment steeped in silence, and something Mark couldn't quite name. Something just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The mansion was vast, its endless halls winding through forgotten corridors, its towering bookshelves filled with knowledge Mark doubted anyone had touched in years. Despite the luxury, there was an emptiness here, a hollowness that clung to the air like dust on an abandoned relic. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled him. It was the way the staff moved, quick, efficient, and careful never to meet his gaze. It was the way Eleanor watched him at dinner, her eyes calculating, as if she were measuring something unseen. And it was the way certain doors remained locked, their brass handles gleaming in the dim light, secrets hiding just beyond them. One afternoon, as Eleanor entertained a call in her study, Mark passed by the open door. He had intended to keep walking, but something caught his eye. On the desk, beside a stack of neatly arranged papers, sat a small, ornate key. It was delicate, intricate, unlike the others he had seen in the house. His gaze flickered to the hallway. No one was around. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped inside, fingers closing around the cool metal. The weight of it felt significant, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He slipped it into his pocket just as Eleanor's voice echoed from the other room. He was gone before she could return. That night, long after the house had settled into its familiar stillness, Mark lay awake, turning the key over in his fingers. He had passed enough locked doors in the estate to know it belonged to one of them. But which one? And what was Eleanor keeping hidden? A thought whispered through him, one he could not ignore. If he was ever going to understand why she had chosen him, he needed to know what lay behind those doors. The house was darker at night, the shadows deeper. Mark moved carefully through the hall, his breath barely audible over the creak of the floorboards. The key felt like a burning weight in his palm as he approached one of the locked doors. His fingers trembled slightly as he slid the key into the lock. A quiet click, the door eased open, revealing a room unlike any other in the house. The air was thick with dust, untouched by time. Faded wallpaper curled at the edges, and old furniture sat draped in white sheets, their ghostly forms barely visible in the moonlight. Along the far wall stood a wooden desk, its surface covered in stacks of old papers, photographs, and books. Mark's pulse quickened as he stepped inside. The photographs were the first thing he noticed. A younger Eleanor standing beside a man who must have been her late husband. They looked happy, their smiles captured in still moments from time long past. But beside those images were others. A second couple, unfamiliar. And then, at the edge of the desk, he found the letters. The handwriting was sharp, slanted with emotion. You ruined everything. My family was left with nothing because of your lies. Mark's breath hitched. It was addressed to his father. A sinking feeling settled in his stomach as he rifled through the documents. There were legal papers, records of business deals that had gone bad, deals involving his father. And then at the very bottom of the pile, he found something that made his blood run cold. A marriage contract. His name. Eleanor's name. The date was weeks before they had ever met. Mark staggered back, the paper trembling in his hands. This wasn't a spontaneous arrangement. Eleanor had planned it from the very beginning. She had chosen him for a reason. A floorboard creaked behind him. Enjoying yourself? The voice was smooth, controlled, but there was something darker underneath. Mark spun around, the documents still clutched in his fingers. Eleanor stood in the doorway, bathed in the soft glow of the hallway light. She did not look surprised. You knew, Mark whispered. Eleanor stepped forward, her gaze flickering to the papers in his hand. Of course I knew. This isn't a marriage, he said, his voice low. It's a trap. She smiled faintly. A trap is only a trap if you don't see it coming. Mark felt a chill creep up his spine. Why me? Eleanor sighed, folding her arms. Because you were perfect. His grip tightened on the papers. Perfect for what? For making things right, she said simply. Mark shook his head, anger bubbling beneath his fear. You wanted revenge. You didn't care who I was, just that I was his son. Eleanor's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. Your father stole from my family. He left us ruined. My husband, her lips pressed together, her composure finally cracking just slightly. He didn't survive it. Mark took a step back, shaking his head. So what? You marry me, control my life, and suddenly the past is fixed. She exhaled sharply, as if his words irritated her. You don't understand. Then make me understand, he snapped. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. I spent years watching my life fall apart because of what your father did, she said. And when he died, he took the consequences with him. Her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. But you were still here. Mark's stomach twisted. You can't punish a man who's already dead, she continued, tilting her head. But his son? His son could still feel the weight of it. The realization settled over him like a slow-moving storm. You think this is justice, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor studied him for a long moment before turning toward the door. Justice is a matter of perspective. Mark's fists clenched at his sides. I won't let you control me. She paused just for a second. Then, without looking back, she said, "You already signed the papers, Mark. You're already mine." The words sent a chill down his spine. And then she was gone. Mark stood in the dim light of the forgotten room, his heart pounding in his chest. He had walked into this thinking it was a way out of his struggles. But now he understood. He wasn't the one who had chosen Eleanor. She had chosen him. And if he wasn't careful, he wouldn't be able to escape her. The days after Mark's discovery felt different. The air in the estate, once just unsettling, now felt suffocating, charged with an invisible tension. Eleanor went about her routine as if nothing had changed, her demeanor as composed as ever. But Mark could feel it, an awareness in the way she looked at him, a quiet calculation behind every glance. She knew something was off. He had to be careful. The staff remained distant, their eyes darting away whenever he walked past. But there was one exception, Mr. Harris. The estate's head butler had always carried himself with quiet authority. But now, Mark noticed something else in the older man's gaze. A knowing, an understanding of something unspoken. One evening, when the rest of the staff had retired for the night, Mark found him in the library, methodically placing books back on the shelves. "Mr. Harris," Mark said, his voice low. The butler paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Yes, Mr. Davis?" Mark hesitated, then stepped closer. "You've been here a long time, haven't you?" Mr. Harris resumed, shelving the books. "Long enough." Mark exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I need to know, am I the first?" The book in Mr. Harris's hand stilled for just a moment before he slid it into place. He turned, his expression unreadable. "No," he said simply. The single word sent a shiver through Mark. Mr. Harris's voice remained even. "You're not the first young man to find himself bound to this house by circumstances beyond his control." Mark swallowed hard. What happened to them? The older man's gaze didn't waver. Some left, some didn't. A chill ran down Mark's spine. "She never does anything without a reason," Mr. Harris continued. "And she doesn't like to lose." Mark clenched his fists. "I need to get out." Mr. Harris studied him for a long moment before nodding ever so slightly. "Then you'll need help." It wasn't an offer, but an acknowledgement. A flicker of an unspoken alliance. And it was all Mark needed. That night, Mark called Peter. His friend answered on the third ring, his voice groggy. "Dude, it's late. I need your help," Mark said urgently. There was a pause, then the sound of sheets rustling as Peter sat up. "What's going on?" Mark hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Hypothetically speaking, if someone signed a contract, say a marriage contract, under coercion or false pretenses, is there a way to void it? Silence stretched on the other end of the line. "Mark," Peter said slowly, "are you in some kind of trouble?" Mark exhaled sharply. "Just answer the question. If you can prove coercion, fraud, or that the person entered the agreement under duress, there's a case to nullify it," Peter said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "But you'd need solid evidence. And if the other party has power, connections, it's not easy." Mark closed his eyes. He already knew that. "Mark," Peter pressed, "what's going on?" "I can't talk about it yet," Mark admitted. "But thanks." There was another pause before Peter sighed. "Whatever it is, be careful." Mark ended the call, gripping the phone tightly. Careful. That was the only option he had left. With Mr. Harris's subtle guidance, Mark began his search. He had already found proof of Eleanor's grudge against his father. But if he was going to take her down, he needed something stronger. Something undeniable. It started with small things. Financial records tucked away in a locked drawer in her study. Business dealings that, upon closer inspection, were built on deception. Promises that never held weight. Funds that seemed to vanish into thin air. Late one night, he found the most damning piece yet. A file hidden beneath layers of neatly stacked documents. Inside, it detailed a pattern. Eleanor's history of manipulating young men, using them as pawns in business arrangements, financial maneuvers, and in some cases, things that suggested something even darker. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized. He was just the latest in a long line of carefully chosen players in her grand design. He snapped a few pictures with his phone, heart pounding. This was it. This was what he needed. The next morning, Eleanor was waiting for him in the breakfast room. She didn't speak at first, merely sipping her tea as he hesitated in the doorway. Then, without looking up, she said, "You've been busy." Mark stiffened. Eleanor set her cup down gently, turning her sharp gaze on him. "Don't play coy with me, Mark. If you think you can outmaneuver me, you are sorely mistaken." His pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." A slow, cold smile curled at her lips. "You really think I don't notice when someone moves things in my study?" she mused. "You think I don't know when a locked drawer has been tampered with?" Mark clenched his fists under the table. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "If you betray me, you'll wish you hadn't." There was no emotion in her voice. No doubt, just a statement of fact. Mark held her gaze, forcing himself not to flinch. "Is that a threat?" She exhaled softly, as if he had disappointed her. "It's a warning." She stood then, smoothing out the fabric of her dress. "You've already chosen your path, Mark. But be careful. Escaping me may be far more dangerous than staying." With that, she walked past him, leaving the room with the same unshaken composure she always carried. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She knew, and now, it was only a matter of time before she decided to act. Whatever he was going to do, he had to do it fast. The weight of the envelope in Mark's hands felt heavier than it should. Inside it lay the culmination of everything he had discovered. Proof of Eleanor's fraud, her manipulation, her calculated deception. It was more than enough to end this, to sever the strings she had so carefully tied around his life. The mansion was unervingly quiet as he made his way to the grand sitting room. The ticking of an antique clock echoed through the air, marking each second like a countdown. He had told Eleanor they needed to talk, and, true to her nature, she had agreed without question. She was waiting for him when he entered, seated in one of the high-backed velvet chairs, her hands resting elegantly on the armrests. The fire in the grand fireplace cast flickering shadows across the room, its warmth unable to chase away the cold tension between them. Mark shut the doors behind him. She watched him, eyes sharp, unreadable. "You look serious," she noted. "That's never a good sign." Mark exhaled, stepping forward. "We need to end this." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "In what exactly?" "This," he said, tossing the envelope onto the table between them. It slid across the polished wood, stopping just in front of her. "This lie, this game, it's over." She didn't move to open it. "You sound so certain," she murmured. "I am." A beat of silence. Then, slowly, she reached forward, taking the envelope between her manicured fingers. She unfolded the documents inside, her eyes scanning them with careful precision. Mark watched, waiting for a reaction. When she finally looked up, something flickered across her face, something dangerously close to amusement. "Fraud," she read aloud, tapping the paper lightly. "Embezzlement. Conspiracy." Her lips curled faintly. "And here I thought you weren't paying attention all these months." Mark's jaw tightened. "I was." Eleanor leaned back, setting the documents aside. "And what do you plan to do with these, Mark?" His voice was firm. "Turn them over to the authorities." For the first time since he had met her, Eleanor's composure cracked. It was subtle, the smallest shift in her expression, the faintest tightening of her grip on the armrest. Then, just as quickly, she recovered. "You have no idea what you're doing," she said smoothly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." She tilted her head, studying him. "No, you don't," she corrected. "You think this is simple, don't you? That exposing me will make everything right? That once I'm gone, you'll finally be free?" She exhaled softly, shaking her head. "You're still so young." Mark stepped closer. "This isn't about me. It's about the people you've hurt. The ones you used, manipulated. The ones you left with nothing while you built your empire on lies." His voice hardened. "You spent your life trying to destroy my father's legacy, but look what you've done to your own." Something in her expression shifted. "You think I had a choice?" she said, and for the first time, there was something raw in her voice, something close to anger. "Your father stole everything from me. My husband, my security, my future. I did what I had to do to survive." Mark's fists clenched. "And what about the people you stole from? The ones that got caught in your path?" Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. She sat there, still and silent. And for the first time since he had met her, she looked tired. "You don't have to fight anymore," Mark said, his voice softer now. "You don't have to keep chasing something that's already gone." Her eyes flickered toward the documents once more. The clock on the mantel chimed. And then, the sound of footsteps. Mark turned just as the doors swung open. Uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by Peter. His friend's eyes met his across the room, and Mark felt a surge of relief. The lead officer stepped forward, his voice firm. "Eleanor Brooks, we have a warrant for your arrest." Eleanor remained seated, her expression unreadable. Mark watched as the officers approached, handcuffs at the ready. But just before they reached her, she turned her gaze back to him. "You may think you've won," she murmured, her voice quiet, almost resigned. "But revenge isn't so easily undone." Then, with the same dignity she had always carried, she rose to her feet. She didn't resist, didn't protest. As they placed the cold steel around her wrists, she merely lifted her chin, allowing them to lead her from the room. Mark stood there, unmoving, as her figure disappeared down the corridor. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of her presence lift. And yet, her final words lingered. A warning, or perhaps a truth he hadn't yet fully understood. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, thick with unspoken tension. Mark sat in the witness stand, hands folded in his lap, staring ahead at the woman who had turned his life into something unrecognizable. Eleanor Brooks sat at the defense table, composed as ever, her silver hair perfectly in place, her gaze unwavering as she listened to the proceedings. The prosecution presented the evidence, the fraudulent business dealings, the financial manipulations, the elaborate web of deception she had spun over decades. The weight of it all was undeniable. But when it was Mark's turn to speak, he found himself hesitating. He had every reason to condemn her, every reason to want her locked away for what she had done, not just to him, but to countless others before him. And yet, as he looked at her, something inside him wavered. He saw not just the woman who had trapped him in a cold, calculated marriage, but the woman who had spent years consumed by loss, by grief, by a thirst for justice that had twisted into something darker. So when he spoke, his words did not come from a place of hatred. "She's guilty," he admitted, "but she's not a monster." The courtroom murmured. Mark continued, his voice steady. "She lost everything. She spent her life trying to fix a past that couldn't be undone. And in doing so, she became the very thing she despised." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but for the first time, her fingers tightened slightly on the table's edge. Mark met the judge's gaze. "I'm not saying she doesn't deserve consequences. She does. But what she needs isn't just punishment. It's the chance to stop running from ghosts." The sentence was lighter than it could have been. Years in prison, but not a lifetime. A consequence, but not complete destruction. Eleanor didn't speak as the verdict was read. But just before she was led away, she turned to Mark, and for the first time since he had met her, she nodded. A small, almost imperceptible motion. A silent acknowledgement. A farewell. The letter arrived weeks later, delivered in a thick, cream-colored envelope. Mark had expected it. Inside, Eleanor's handwriting was neat, elegant, deliberate. "Mark, by now, I imagine you feel some sense of relief, knowing that I no longer cast a shadow over your life. You were never meant to be collateral damage. You were simply convenient, a means to an end. At least, that is what I told myself when I chose you. But I see now that revenge is its own prison. For years, I believed that if I took enough, if I balanced the scales, I would find peace. But peace never came. Only more ghosts. I have spent my life holding on to the past. But you still have a future. I have signed over the estate to you. Do with it what you will. Burn it, sell it, live in it. It doesn't matter to me. But I hope you will use it for something greater than what it has been, a monument to pain. And one more thing, Mark. Be careful not to become the thing you hate. Hate is a fire that consumes everything in its path, even the one who holds it. Perhaps, in another life, we could have met differently. Perhaps, in another life, I could have been better. This one, however, is already over. Eleanor. Mark closed the letter and exhaled. The estate was empty when he returned for the last time. The vast halls, the heavy silence, the towering windows that had once made him feel small. It all felt different now. It no longer belonged to Eleanor, and it no longer belonged to him. He sold it within the month. The money did exactly what it was meant to do. It wiped away every last bit of debt his father had left behind. It secured his mother's medical treatments, ensuring she would never have to worry again. It covered his sister's tuition, giving her the education she deserved. And with what remained, he built something new, the Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the name, about rewriting the legacy that had been twisted by revenge, about honoring the man who had unknowingly become the catalyst for a war that never should have been fought. It was about giving others the second chance that neither Eleanor nor his father had ever given themselves. Law school felt different now. Mark still studied long hours, still buried himself in books and case studies, but the fire that drove him had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about purpose. He interned at a legal aid center, working with people who had been cheated, manipulated, people who had been used as pawns in someone else's game. He saw Eleanor in some of them. He saw himself in others. One crisp autumn afternoon, another letter arrived. He knew the handwriting before he even opened it. Mark, I've had much time to reflect. For years, I believed that revenge would heal the wounds Harold's death left behind. But I see now that revenge is just another form of grief. And grief, when left unchecked, becomes a cage. I built mine carefully, believing it would keep me safe. But all it did was keep me trapped. You were kind to me, even when I gave you no reason to be. Even when I took from you, you did not become like me. That is strength. Forgiveness is not weakness. It is the hardest thing we can offer another. And though I may never be worthy of it, I hope you find it in yourself for your sake more than mine. We are not bound by the past, Mark. We are only bound by what we choose to carry forward. I hope you choose wisely. Eleanor. Mark folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. The sun was setting over campus as he walked across the courtyard, his breath curling in the crisp air. In the distance, the scholarship ceremony was beginning. The plaque had been placed just outside the lecture hall. The Harold Brooks Scholarship Fund for Second Chances. Mark stood before the gathered students, taking a breath before he spoke. This fund isn't just about money, he said. It's about turning pain into purpose, about making sure that no one else has to fight the same battles alone. He paused, glancing out of the crowd. We cannot change the past, he continued, but we can decide what we do with it. The applause was quiet at first, then steady, then strong. As the ceremony ended, Mark lingered for a moment, standing beneath the sky as the last traces of sunlight faded. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against Eleanor's letter. She had been right. We are only bound by what we choose to carry forward. And as Mark walked away from the ceremony, he finally felt the weight of the past begin to lift. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. The past has a way of holding on, its grip tightening with each bitter memory, each unresolved wound. Some people spend their lives trying to outrun it, while others, like Eleanor, let shape them into something unrecognizable. For years, she believed that vengeance would heal her pain, that if she took enough, controlled enough, she could rewrite the story of her loss. But revenge is a hollow pursuit. It devours everything in its path, leaving behind only ashes. Mark could have chosen a hater. He had every reason to. She had deceived him, used him, turned his life into a twisted game of retribution. But in the end, he made a different choice. Forgiveness. Not because Eleanor deserved it, but because he did. Because carrying the weight of another person's hatred is just another form of being trapped. Eleanor had spent decades shackled to the past, but Mark refused to do the same. He saw what vengeance had done to her, how it had turned her into someone who no longer recognized herself. And he realized that he had a chance to break the cycle, to choose something else. So he chose to build. Instead of letting her destruction consume him, He turned it into something meaningful. He repurposed the very wealth she had accumulated through deception into something that could truly change lives. He honored a man he had never known, righting a wrong that had been buried beneath years of resentment. And in doing so, he found peace. Not every story of betrayal has to end in ruin. Not every wound has to fester into something darker. We are not bound by the mistakes of those who came before us. We are not destined to carry their grudges, their pain, their wars. We are only bound by the choices we make for ourselves. And Mark's choice was clear: to let go, to move forward, to prove that even after everything, there is always another path. A path not carved by vengeance, but by the quiet, steady power of forgiveness. Lessons from the story. Mark's journey teaches us that revenge is a never-ending cycle. It doesn't heal, it doesn't bring justice, and it certainly doesn't restore what was lost. Eleanor spent her life chasing retribution, only to realize too late that vengeance had consumed her. It had turned her into the very thing she despised. But Mark made a different choice. He chose to turn his pain into purpose, to break free from the past instead of being trapped by it. His story reminds us that true strength lies not in seeking revenge, but in knowing when to let go. Forgiveness is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate act of freedom. We're not defined by the actions of those before us. We're defined by the choices we make moving forward. And in that choice, there is power. Call to action. If this story moved you, if it made you think about life, forgiveness, and second chances, then don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button to show your support for stories that inspire change. Share this video with friends and family, because everyone deserves to hear a story that can shift perspectives. Leave a comment below and tell us your thoughts. What would you have done if you were in Mark's position? Do you believe in forgiveness, even when it seems impossible? And most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another powerful, soul-stirring story. Let's continue to spread stories of resilience, redemption, and the power of the human heart. Thank you for watching, and remember, your past does not define you. Your choices do.